Hello again, and thanks for joining us for this Monday's edition of Alaska Weather. I'm David Percy. Up first, we've got forecast rainfall amounts here starting yesterday afternoon at 4 p.m. until 7 a.m. Wednesday morning. And you can see out to the west there, Yakutat, about 1.5 to 2 inches of rain, which for that location isn't that big of a deal for that time frame. But 3 to 4 inches forecast for Skagway, Haines, Gustavus, Juneau, Hoonah, and Pelican. That's a little more significant for those areas. And Sitka, 2 to 3 inches in the forecast, and even up to inch and a half down toward Petersburg and Cake. And these heavy rains have occurred, and that's resulted in a flood warning for the Taiaya River near Skagway. And that's out until 7 p.m. Tuesday for flooding in that area. And then next, we've got a flood watch continues out. It was out yesterday and it remains out today. Heavy rainfall amounts of 2 to 5 inches possible in the watch area there, which is the green shaded area, as you can see on the map to the right there. And that's for the northern inner channels of southeast Alaska, including Haines, Skagway, Juneau, Gustavus, Hoonah, and Sitka, Tanaki Springs also. And of course for Haines there's a flood advisory out, and then Skagway, near Skagway, is a flood warning out now, but watch remains out for the remainder of the areas. And periods of heavy rainfall could result in fast rises on rivers and streams, with some rivers overflowing their banks. And then of course heavy rainfall concentrated in steep terrain, which it usually does, could result in landslides. And now there's a flood advisory out, as I mentioned, for the Haines Borough, and that's out, let's see, until 5 a.m. Tuesday. So overnight tonight, and then it should end by 5 a.m. Tuesday there. Or, they'll kick it out longer if it keeps raining enough. And that's for minor flooding in the Haines Borough. I believe Haines has picked up over 2 1/3 inches of rain in the last 24 hours, with a 12-hour amount of 1 1/3 inches of rain. And from there, looking at satellite image, you can see that south to north flow of moisture, one surge pushing northward with the low center coming inland up across right along the border there. And clouds over the eastern interior resulted in some areas of light rain, nothing very significant, really just a few hundredths of an inch scattered over the eastern interior areas. A little bit heavier over the eastern Copper River Basin, in some locations like May Creek had about 0.8 of an inch today. Otherwise, Yakutat picked up 1 inch of rain, and Juneau had 0.5 inch today. These are 12-hour amounts again, and pretty gusty winds along with this frontal system in advance of it, as you can see it moving up. Also out to the west there you can see a weakening system, really not producing a whole lot of rain, more gusty winds with that system, but as I saw, not much, about 0.2 of an inch falling at Atka Island. That was about it. Low center there back between Shimmy and Adak, just north of the chain. And on the chart today, 978 millibar low there. A little more of a wind producer than a rain producer, seeing winds gusting 50 miles an hour more with gale force northerlies there for the western Aleutians. And basically small craft advisory level winds, with the exception about gusts of 45 miles an hour. Could be gales there in advance of the front at Nikolsky, Frontenac Island, and maybe even developing over on Alaska Island, with some areas of light rain associated with that front, but nothing heavy. The heavy rain there over the eastern North Gulf Coast. Again, Yakutat having about 1 inch fall today. Juneau again, 0.5 inch. And then King Salmon with that low over the southwest interior, one of the heavier amounts there. They picked up 2/3 of an inch of, King Salmon, or Iliamna had 0.2 of an inch. Ketchikan had the 2/3 of an inch in the southern panhandle, so even the rain all the way down into the southern southeast coast, in spite of that surface high there just to the east. Otherwise, areas of flurries and some low clouds and fog along the Arctic coast with east winds 15 to 25 miles an hour, maybe a few higher gusts in some areas. Some scattered snow showers in the Brooks Range. Scattered showers over the western interior, again, mostly under 1/10 of an inch or so. I believe St. Mary's may have picked up 1/10 of an inch, but pretty light on the shower activity over the southwest interior, as well as up in the interior there. And for tonight, that front edge is eastward slowly, being held back by a persistent upper-level ridge over western Canada. And so south to north flow keeps the rain going over the northern panhandle. That keeps the flood watch going as well. But low pressure now over Cook Inlet kind of drifts eastward, dries out over the southwest interior. That'll increase the shower chances and rain over Cook Inlet. I should say light rain, light showers, Prince William Sound, Kenai Peninsula, Cook Inlet, and up into the Susitna-Manuska Valley areas, southern Copper River Basin. Of course, any elevation is going to be in the form of snow. Otherwise dry over the western interior. Low clouds and fog and flurries continue for the north slope in the Arctic coast. Temperatures mostly in the mid to upper 20s there for tonight, and some scattered isolated snow showers of the light variety down across eastern Brooks Range, maybe into the Yukon Flats. And then for tomorrow, the interior looking pretty good. Partly sunny skies over most areas, variably cloudy, mostly cloudy in other areas. North Gulf Coast could see a few sun breaks. And that frontal boundary staying put there over the northern panhandle. So periods of rain, moderate, briefly heavy at times, but the rainfall rate should begin to subside tomorrow afternoon with, again, rain all the way down in toward Dixon Entrance, Metlakatla, Ketchikan, over toward Misty Fjords. Front out to the west there pushes rain into Kodiak Island and Bristol Bay. And for Wednesday, low pressure moves to just southwest of Cape Newenham. Front pushes rain and gusty winds into the Kuskokwim Valley, all the way northward there to the south coast of the Seward Peninsula, into southern Cook Inlet, and heaviest rainfall southern Kenai Peninsula, western Prince William Sound. Showers slowly diminishing over the panhandle but persisting through the afternoon. Dry up over the northern interior. Lows for tonight in the 50s for the panhandle, otherwise mid-30s to lower 40s elsewhere, and highs upper 40s to lower 50s, mid-50s Kodiak Island, 58 to 62 southern panhandle, followed by lows 40s to lower 50s for the southeast coast, 30 to 40 most areas, inland areas of the state, to lower to mid-40s out toward the coastline, followed by highs on Wednesday, mostly in the 40s to lower 50s, mid-50s say for Homer and Kodiak, and lower 60s for the southern panhandle. Up north, lows in the 20s, down to 20 at Anatuvik Pass with 29 at Ambler, upper 20s for the Arctic coast, and upper 20s to mid-30s for the central interior, near 40 out toward the Bering Strait. Highs tomorrow, lower to mid-30s for the Arctic coast into the North Slope and Brooks Range, south of the mountains in the 40s, followed by lows again, 20s, Brooks Range on out, upper 20s to lower 30s, northern interior valleys, right around the freeze point there for the Fairbanks area, near 40 for the Bering Strait. Highs, lower 30s for the Arctic coast, and 40s to lower 50s south of the Brooks Range. Out to the southwest coast, lows in the 30s, but the Aleutians will be in the 40s for the lows. Highs in the 40s along the southwest coast, Pribilofs, upper 40s to lower 50s for the Aleutians, mid-50s for the Alaska Peninsula, mid to upper 40s for the peninsula for the lows on Wednesday morning, 39 for the, or upper 30s for the Pribilof, St. Lawrence Island, the southwest coast, highs mostly in the 40s to lower 50s.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
And moving on to flying weather, IFR, Arctic coast and North Slope, eastern Brooks Range, all the way down there to the Mid-Tanana Valley area and southwestward, all the way across the Kuskokwim Valley to the Kuskokwim Mountains, and marginal VFR from about Togiak eastward to Igigik and King Salmon. Cook Inlet, marginal VFR, Manuska Susitna Valley, IFR along the North Gulf Coast, Panhandle, solid IFR, and the Aleutians from Adak eastward to the Alaska Peninsula, IFR, and then St. Lawrence Island to St. Matthew Island, IFR. For the afternoon, looking like, there we go, some marginal VFR now for the North Slope and Arctic coast, IFR for the eastern Aleutians, northeastward there to Cape Newenham, and then southeastward across the Alaska Peninsula, catching Sitkinak Island. Kodiak Island, northward into central Cook Inlet, about, looks marginal. Most of the Kenai Peninsula, Prince William Sound, southern Copper River Basin, marginal VFR. IFR still pretty well entrenched over the panhandle, but Yakutat is in a VFR zone, hopefully. And for the Susitna Valley, becoming VFR. In the northern and northwestern Copper River Basin, Alaska Range, all VFR right up into Nenana, maybe Fairbanks, Delta Junction, Northway Tok, all looking good for tomorrow afternoon. And then for Wednesday morning, we've got areas of VFR scattered around the interior with areas of marginal VFR scattered around, and then some isolated IFR as well. Southeast coast, though, all IFR. Eastern North Gulf Coast looks VFR. And VFR for Adak. Otherwise, eastern Bering Sea, marginal VFR with areas of IFR. And another band of IFR pushing into the far western Aleutians. Wednesday afternoon, IFR right along the southwest coast across the Alaska Peninsula, up across Nunivak Island to St. Lawrence Island. And more IFR there, southern Kenai Peninsula, Resurrection Bay, and then the Panhandle, all IFR. Some VFR for Yakutat and across the Copper River Basin, Manuska, Susitna Valley, northern Cook Inlet, up into the interior, just a little bit of marginal VFR over the Yukon Flats, and then down across the mountains into the eastern Alaska Range with some possible IFR there for Northway Tok to just south of Eagle. Anatuvik, marginal VFR, improving to VFR, just improved lower conditions in the morning for both Anatuvik and Adigan, better as the day wears on. Lake Clark, go marginal there, and then looks like Merrill, VFR, the way it looks at this point in time. Rainy, VFR. Windy, same forecast, VFR throughout the day, especially in the afternoon. Same thing for Isabel. Mintasta, marginal VFR to start, gradually improving to VFR, improvement throughout the day for that pass. Tanita, marginal VFR to VFR. Portage, IFR to marginal, and Chilkoot and White, IFR. Freezing levels, about 2,000 feet over the central interior, 2,000 to 3,000 over southern Alaska, and from the surface to 2,000 over the northern interior. 2,000 to 6,000 feet there, southern Bering Sea and the Aleutians, and 6,000 to 10,000 feet over the Panhandle. And moisture still over the southeast coast. Could be some areas of considerable moderate rime icing, otherwise looks like mostly isolated, moderate to light, and looks like some considerable moderate rime icing approaching the Alaska Peninsula. And for the jet stream, good upper level low there just north of the eastern Aleutians, but the stronger jet now south of the area. We've got northerly 70 knots over the central Bering Sea, westerlies at 65 there over the eastern interior area, southwest 70 into the Panhandle. 9,000 feet, we've got a low there almost right over Yakutat, kind of moving off to the northeast with a trough, so southwest 40 in the northern Panhandle, central areas actually, south-southwest 45 knots Alaska Peninsula, pretty light over mainland Alaska, northern Bering Sea and the Arctic. High pressure at 3,000 feet makes for light wind conditions over much of interior Alaska down into the southeast coast, otherwise southeast 55 knot winds across the Aleutian Range and Bristol Bay, Cape Newenham and those areas, turning northerly to about 50 knots there across the east central Aleutians. Pretty light winds over the Fox Islands and Alaska Peninsula. Turbulence-wise, considerable moderate chop, especially for small aircraft. Kodiak Island, Shelikof Strait, the Aleutian Range, Bristol Bay, in across the southwest interior, Auckland Mountains, as well as the central Aleutians.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Carrie.haisley, Chief of the Emergency Services and Multimedia Branch for the National Weather Service in Anchorage. With me today I have Dr. Doug Wesley, a physical scientist for the National Weather Service Alaska Region Headquarters. Doug, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome, Carrie. Hello.
Hello. So you're here to talk to us a little bit about something called CocoRUS, which is the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. And I understand that CocoRUS is a network of volunteers who take weather observations. Can you tell us a little bit more about what CocoRUS is?
Yes, it began in the lower 48, 20 some years ago, and it's expanded during those 2 decades. They're getting something like 10 to 15,000 rainfall reports per day from the lower 48.
Wow, that's a lot of different reports. So how many reports do we get in Alaska right now?
Well, it varies maybe 10 to 25. But if you consider the large areas we're talking about, we have a lot of gaps to fill. Any observation is better than no observation, but there are large areas in Alaska. Alaska covers 3 million square miles. There's a lot of data gaps in that space, so we'd like to enhance it.
Sure. So tell us then a bit about why these observations are so important to Alaska and why we need to expand the number of them that we're getting.
Yes, Alaska, as you know, has large areas with a lot of complex terrain, and there are no weather observing stations or radar. So CoCoRaHS can help fill the data gaps, so you can at least get some idea of what's actually falling from the sky at those locations. CoCoRaHS increases the amount of timely weather observations available to meteorologists and other decision makers, especially in hazardous type of weather, both rain and snow and the occasional hailstorm that we get up here. CoCoRaHS observations can help forecasters identify long-term precipitation and snowfall trends in a climate sense. And just overall, they increase the amount of timely weather observations available to the public.
So then let's talk a little bit about each of the different types of observations. So it's the rain, hail, and snow network. So let's start by talking a little bit about rain observations and tell us a little bit about how you take those and how long it takes a volunteer to get a rain observation.
Okay, this is a 4-inch gauge, just the basic gauge, which you use for both rain and snowfall. But the rain observations are pretty quick. It's a matter of 2 or 3 minutes that each volunteer goes out and takes a reading, and then they enter these on the computer, and they're immediately available for observation on the computer and on the maps, so that you can see your report. In the wintertime, it's a little bit more complicated. We require the observers to measure not only the snow accumulation, but also liquid equivalent. So they've got to melt the snowfall. This involves 2 of these gauges and a snowboard. And it's maybe a 10-minute observation per day during the winter. But the snowfall is so variable that even across town and in especially the remote areas, it's crucial that we increase this number of snow observations in the network.
Right. I understand that we can only take observations in places where we have weather service offices. And so we rely on all of these volunteers to help us fill gaps. And it's also interesting to know how snowfall varies across like large spaces or even small cities. So I notice here in Anchorage, for example, we can have a vastly different amount of snow on the east side of town and the west side of town. And so it seems like these observations would help us to better understand what's going on in places besides just where the office is.
That's correct. In any given snowfall, there are typically large variances, as you know, and we rely on reports from the public and from National Weather Service cooperative spotters to map out the snowfall that occurs so that we can predict it better in the future.
Sure. So we talked about rain observations and we talked about snow observations, and you said for each of those, if it's rain, it only takes a couple minutes, and then it can take about 10 minutes if it's snow. Hail was the other one that we didn't talk about yet. Tell us just a little bit about the hail observations that CoCoRaHS observers take.
Yeah, the CoCoRaHS network, it has a hail pad, and it's just a simple block of styrofoam covered with aluminum foil, and you can approximate the size of hail by measuring the dent that the hail causes on the pad. And this can give us an estimate of hail size. We don't get hail very often in Alaska, but I've seen it 2 or 3 times in my 5 years in Anchorage, and some of it up to a ½ inch. And I'm sure there's been larger hail up in the interior at times.
So let's talk a little bit about how these rain, hail, and snow observations can help forecasters. So we have people who forecast the weather, and we also have people who work on the hydrology side, and I can see that maybe CoCoRaHS will be beneficial to both of them. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, it's beneficial to the hydrologic forecaster who's concerned about flooding, and rainfall comprises one of the causes of a flood, or it can exacerbate high water conditions. So the more the hydrologist has to look at in terms of data from recent rainfall, the more information they have to work with when they're generating a forecast. The weather forecasters in the wintertime at the Weather Service office can use these observations also to help with past case studies, to verify model data, and to get a handle on what's actually happening out the window. And that's important in the forecast process.
Yeah, it seems like you can never have too much information when you're issuing a forecast. So it only takes a few minutes most of the time to take these observations. So let's say I'm interested in becoming a volunteer for CocoRAS. How do I get involved?
Yeah, the website is very useful, cocoras.org, and it has a number of video-based training tutorials that take you right on from measuring rainfall to a video tutorial on measuring snowfall. It has the maps available in real time, and you can go back and look at that old data too through those maps. And so it's a very useful, comprehensive website.
Very interesting. And anybody can get involved, right? You don't have to be a meteorologist.
That's right. And, we love to have 24, once a day reports throughout the year, but if you can't, then so be it. And we have observers, some observers are out of town for periods of time, or maybe they can only report, a week or two of precipitation, but it's still useful. It's still data that we look at. So the more the better, but you can get involved even if you aren't at a location 24/7.
Doug, I really appreciate you coming on to our program today to talk about CocoRAS. Hopefully we can have you back in the studio at some point so we can talk more about it and then talk more about the different types of observations and the tools that observers use.
That would be great. Yeah.
So thank you for your time, and thank you so much for joining this edition of Alaska Weather Facts.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back. Kind of a squirrely wind pattern here for areas of the southeast coastal forecast for tomorrow. Southeast 25 knots along the coast of Prince of Wales Island. Otherwise, the central coast north to northwest, 15 to 20 knots, seas 7 to 8 feet. On the north coast, westerlies at 10 knots, south 10 for Lynn Canal, light variable winds for the central inside channels, southeast 20 knots for Clarence Strait. And for the day Wednesday, south winds 15 knots for Clarence Strait, Stevens Passage, southeast at 15, and still southeast winds on the light side, Lynn Canal at 10 knots. For the central coast, gale warnings, south winds 35 knots, seas 13 feet, and for the south coast, south winds at 30 knots, and the north coast, winds will be southeast at 30 knots with 12-foot seas. Prince William Sound, southeast winds 10 knots, light variable winds for the eastern North Gulf Coast, variable winds at 20 knots for the Barren Islands, variable 25-knot winds for Kamishak Bay, and for Cook Inlet, south winds 15 knots with 4-foot seas. And for Wednesday, small craft advisories for Cook Inlet, northeast winds 25 to 30 knots with 8 to 10-foot seas. Good gales for the North Gulf Coast, southeast winds 40 knots. Gale warnings for Prince William Sound, east winds 35 knots, seas 9 feet. And for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, southeast winds 40 knots. And then for Kodiak Island, Tuesday, small craft advisories, south to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Bristol Bay, gale warnings, east winds 35 knots with 14-foot seas. And the Alaska Peninsula, east to south winds at 30 knots. Outlook for Wednesday, gale warnings for the Alaska Peninsula, winds right out of the west at 35 knots, and south to southeast winds 20 to 30 knots for Kodiak Island. And for Bristol Bay, southeast winds 25 knots, seas subsiding to 6 feet. And for the Unalaska Island area, south to southwest winds at 20 knots for Tuesday. Gale warnings for Unmac Island, west-northwest winds 35 knots, and north to northwest winds at 35 for Adak and Atka, as well as Amchitka Island, Kiskadashimia, north winds 25 knots. And for the western Aleutians on Wednesday, southeast winds 20 knots, central Aleutians northwest at 25, and gale warnings for Unalaska Island for west winds at 25 knots with 15 to 20-foot seas. And for the Kuskokwim Delta coastline south of Nunivak Island, gale warnings tomorrow. East winds 35 knots. Turn northeast and drop to small craft advisory levels at 30 knots for the Pribilof Islands. And for the northern Bering Sea to the Yukon Delta coast, northeast winds at 15 knots. And St. Lawrence Island, about the same, except northeast at 20 with 5-foot seas. And then for Wednesday, Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island, small craft advisories, east to northeast winds 25 knots. Gale warnings now along the Yukon Delta coast for north winds at 35 knots. Gale warnings for St. Lawrence or for St. Matthew and the Pribilofs for north to northwest winds at 35 knots and northeast at 30 for the Kuskokwim Delta coastline. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, east-northeast winds 15 knots, and for the central coast, east winds at 15 knots. East winds 20 knots for the western Arctic coast, and from Wales to Cape Thompson, northeast winds at 15 knots. And for Wednesday, Wales to Cape Thompson, northeast winds 15 knots. Otherwise, for the entire stretch of the Arctic coast, winds will be out of the east at 20 knots with pretty uniform sea heights at 4 to maybe 5 feet. And for tonight, look for areas of flurries and fog along the Arctic coast, locally over the north slope. Possible snow showers up over the northeast interior, but light. Look for increasing chances of rain and showers, Cook Inlet, south central Alaska this evening, and then that'll start to scatter out toward morning. Otherwise, rain, moderate to heavy at times, continues for the Panhandle. Next front pushing wind and rain into the Alaska Peninsula and Pribilofs with stronger northerly winds out over the central Aleutians. And for Tuesday, rain pushes northeastward across Bristol Bay into Kodiak Island. That persistent, slow-moving frontal boundary keeps rain over the northern Panhandle, but becoming lighter, not quite as heavy, and rain will extend down to the southern part as well. Otherwise dry over interior Alaska with some sun breaks. And then that front moves into southern Alaska, bringing rain and gusty winds with it. Wet for Kodiak Island all the way back to the eastern Aleutians. Showers slowly diminishing but persist through the day over the southeast coast. Dry over the north and northeast interior with some fog along the Arctic coast.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.